From the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., this is Rendezvous with History, a podcast that captures the drama of presidential decision-making. Dr. Anthony Eames sits down with prominent scholars and leading citizens to bring to life what happens in the White House and how it shapes the world.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
Welcome back, Rendezvous with History listeners. I'm Dr. Anthony Eames, as always, your host. And here, joining me today is Dr. Randall Fowler, Assistant Professor of Political Rhetoric and Communication at Abilene Christian University and the author of many books, but most recently, Securing the Prize, Presidential Metaphor and U.S. Intervention in the Persian Gulf. Randall, thanks for joining me on the show.
Fun to be here. Thanks, Anthony.
Well, I got to tell you, as I told you in our kind of pre-production conversation, I gave it the old grad student skim. And after giving your book the grad student skim, I decided I need to read this book in a lot further detail because you lay out some really interesting points that we should get into here. But before we do so, I think it's best practice. I mean, why did you want to write this book?
That's a great question. So there's a career answer to that question, a personal answer to that question, and of course an academic answer to that question. So on the career focus side, my first book was about Eisenhower's policy in the Middle East. That book is titled More Than a Doctrine, the Eisenhower Era in the Middle East. And I was really interested in the pivot point from which the United States began to assume primacy from a national security standpoint during the Cold War. From the United Kingdom in that part of the world. And so in studying the Eisenhower presidency, I became really interested in how the arguments that he put forward worked as this fulcrum around which policy advanced, but public opinion didn't necessarily advance with it. And so this book was really inspired in some ways as a spiritual sequel to that one, of not just how did U.S. policy, looking at Department of Defense or the State Department or other organs of the U.S. national security state, but Americans writ large and the United States public opinion, how did that shift regarding the Middle East and the United States' role in that region? And so this book is really focused from a career standpoint on answering those questions that for me began with how did the United States become involved in this really faraway region of the world that, I am originally from Texas, where I'm lucky enough to be a professor. And, it's pretty far away, even though there's a lot of similarities between where I'm from and that part of the world. So how did that actually come to be? The personal question is because I was fortunate. The first country besides Mexico that I went to overseas was Israel. And so I got to go to Israel, and that was quite an eye-opening experience. I actually went for a baseball camp when I was in college. I'm not that great at baseball, but I do know the rules. And so I got to go and coach some kids in that. And out of that was born this really just fascination with that part of the world. So I ended up going back to college, deciding to minor in Arabic, explore the region further, was fortunate enough to be a Fulbright grantee in Jordan, and was able to really spend a lot of time in the region and try to understand different perspectives. And so the reason I'm in communication is because I'm interested in how we come to understand that part of the world, and political rhetoric is a nice disciplinary home for that. And then ultimately the academic question is, I think there's a lot written about how the United States, from a strategic standpoint, from a historical standpoint, from even on just an individual White House standpoint, how the United States got involved in various parts of the Middle East. But really what this book was trying to do was to answer the question of the evolution of U.S. security policy in the Persian Gulf specifically. So a short version to understand the book is that it's trying to tell the history of U.S. Progressive involvement in the Persian Gulf from a public opinion and political rhetoric standpoint. It's trying to answer the question not which general proposed which policy, but how did Americans, through the process of public deliberation, which I argue is ultimately guided through metaphor, come to see this part of the world as a place where it's appropriate for the United States to exercise military, economic, and other forms of power.
Well, I mean, you mentioned in the book that the Middle East is about as far away from the heartland of America as you can get. And yet many Americans have a very distinct view of the Middle East, one that's rife with stereotypes and kind of simplified images of that region. And I will say, maybe I've bought into those stereotypes because I don't really think of the Middle East as a baseball playing region. So you've already.
In my experience, I don't know if it really is, but they were fortunate enough to invite me over. So,
well, you've already busted one stereotype for me: baseball in Israel. But lay out for me before we get into really the departure point of this book, which is beginning with the kind of rhetoric employed by the U.S. administrations of the 1970s, presidential administrations of the 1970s. Lay out for me how Americans kind of came to understand and imagine the Middle East as a place for U.S. engagement, for U.S. attachment before then.
Absolutely. So what the book does is, because how Americans understand the Middle East, as you rightly mentioned, is rife with all these different impressions from all these different sources. There are so many different points of contact for Americans and how we understand any part of our lives, and that applies to other parts of the world just as much as it would apply to our understanding of tax policy or our understanding of states that we haven't been to before. So I think that just to dispel that framework, I'm not coming at it from the expectation that Americans can point out every country on the map or know in depth the ideas of what's going on in each country politically. But I do think that Americans have for a very long time had an imaginative connection to the Middle East. And I think that goes all the way back to the American founding, even all the way back to the Mayflower. And so in the book, what I do is I trace out a couple different lines of representation and imagination that Americans have interacted with the Middle East with. Some of these are more corporeal or governmental. So one of the lines of connection I trace is in trade policy and in exporting and importing. And ironically, one of the things that most Americans don't realize is that cotton played a huge role in U.S. relations to what we now call the Middle East during the 19th century. So leading up to the Civil War, Southern planters believed that King Cotton would come to the aid, meaning that the British Empire, deprived of the raw materials from Southern farms, would come to the aid of the Confederacy against the Union. They were, of course, very wrong. But the reason they were wrong was because the British successfully were able to start planting cotton large scale in the Nile. And so all of a sudden, you have this major cash crop from the United States that becomes a major cash crop of Egypt. And, you can think of what that would do to global commodity markets and how that would result in Reconstruction and changing American policy. In fact, Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, Seward, mentioned this several times during the war about how the Southern planters had thought that they were going to resist the Union war effort through cotton, and actually that it was the Nile that came to the Union's aid. So there's that's one line of continuity, but I think there's other more imaginative lines of continuity that matter a bit as well. One that I trace is the idea of exceptionalism and Orientalism. So Orientalism is, of course, the traditional notion from Edward Said that Westerners tend to view Easterners in stereotypical ways. And while I think that in broad strokes that thesis might be correct, it's probably correct for all regions of the world, right? Middle Easterners might have a broad view of Europeans or a broad view of East Asians or a broad view of Africans and vice versa. And so taking that general insight, I argue that the way that Orientalism has been operationalized in U.S. History is for Americans to see themselves as an exceptional people on the model of biblical Israel, deriving from the Puritans and their self-understanding as a chosen people ordained by God for a mission in the world to do a great project in New England. And that the inverse of that would be, we are not these people over here. And so you see this a lot of times in Puritan discourse. One area that I've done a little bit of research in is Puritan understandings of Islam. And so there's a great sermon by Cotton Mather around the turn of the century, from the 17th to the 18th century, and he gives a sermon talking about Puritan or sailors from New England who were carried off into captivity into the Barbary states and sold in the slave markets of North Africa. And so he's talking about the role of Islam and how Puritans understand themselves in relation to Islam. And what you see there is there's this economy of alterity, right? That we see ourselves in who we are by who we're not. And for the Puritans, of course, and for much of American history, this had strong confessional lines. So the Puritans in particular saw themselves as not Catholic, but they also saw themselves as not Turks or not Muslim. And there's a lot of other, terms of phrase that that might not apply to current day discourse that applied to that day's discourse. And so you have this way of representing the United States where it's deeply embedded in this sense of exceptionality. And of course, we've heard lots of American exceptionalism. I argue that really derives from the notion of the analogy to biblical Israel. And that has shaped a lot of the ways Americans understand the region up to today. So if you fast forward up to debates over Zionism in the early 20th century. One of the reasons why Americans were predisposed to be more pro-Zionist, the idea of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine that was then controlled by the Ottoman Empire and then the British, was because they had for a long time imagined themselves as a similar people. Abraham Lincoln, Herman Melville, all these different thinkers from the 19th century think of America in those terms as an exceptional people.
Well, that's really interesting stuff. And what you've laid out is that, Americans have always been in the Middle East imaginatively, even before the founding, but there's a tipping point, and there's a tipping point where we go from imagination to actually physical presence in the Middle East. You start out the book with Harold Wilson's famous withdrawal east of Suez speech. In the discussion of vacuum and that idea of vacuum as a metaphor, and that it kind of presents a blank canvas, that the people living in the region have no agency. You point out vacuum is an inert term. I wonder if you could go in a little bit to this comparison of metaphor used for British presence in the Middle East, the kind of imperial metaphor, I assume, and American presence in the Middle East. I mean, they're both speaking English. Chips might mean something different here and in London, but ultimately, Americans and British citizens understand each other. So, can you lay out a comparison for me of metaphor used by both those empires?
Yeah, so I trace out lots of different metaphors that attend to these different lines of representation in the book. So one of the ones that I really like is American Protestants described the Middle East as a fossil that needs to be shaken up and revitalized. And that certainly colored the move into World War II. And so during World War II, there's actually a U.S. serviceman stationed in Cairo who wrote back to Washington and said, this region is like the Garden of Eden. It's this place lush with resources, but it's also an unlocked door. And all of these are metaphors that imaginatively convey an image of the Middle East that then, of course, as you say, influences policy later on. One of those that's really key is at the onset of the Cold War, Americans start to conceptualize the Middle East as a vacuum. One reason for that is they start to conceptualize the Middle East as a prize, and that's where the book's title comes from, is securing the prize. The Saudi oil, the region itself, is a prize to be kept from adversarial powers, obviously the Soviet Union in the wake of World War II. And for a time, the British are seen as the power that can uphold containment in the region, keep the prize safe from the bear, if we're going to engage in metaphor. And so British discourse at this time really thinks in terms of analogies and discusses the region in terms of possession. So the British described it as, this is our lake, right? This is something that is ours to protect and ours to keep safe. It's not the Americans' job. It's our job to do this. I really like one document I came across from Anthony Eden. He talked about Gamal Abdel Nasser, the anti-British, anti-European leader of Egypt during the 1950s. He said he's like a rabid dog, or that he's like Hitler, right? And so what you have here are a lot of analogies, metaphors used to work to help people imagine the region in a particular way, which then underwrites policy. So metaphor influences the imagination, which ultimately functions to provide warrants for policy decisions. And then leading up to the 1970s, which is really when the book takes off for its main subject matter. So an easy way to understand the book is that it's a tale of two speeches. In 1968, Harold Wilson, as you mentioned, gives a speech before Parliament where he says, for too long, we've spent too much money on our empire, and so we are going to withdraw all of our forces east of Suez by within the next few years. And so in that moment, you have the British saying, we can no longer be the tentpole for containment for the Soviet Union. And the American defense establishment at that point was kind of thrown into an air of shock. LBJ called that day to ask if he would reverse the decision. And so you have this moment where, Robert McNamara in the 60s says, Britain is in the Middle East, not us. We can't go there. And you look at that moment where they say, oh my gosh, this huge power vacuum is opening up. Vacuums are inert. They're not able to stabilize themselves. They need an outside force to offer that stability. And so in this conceptualization of the Middle East in the wake of the British withdrawal as a vacuum means that something has to come in. And so that's one side of the book is that speech. The other side of the book is Bush's 2003, George W. Bush's 2003 State of the Union address, where he gives the axis of evil speech, where he says, we are going to oppose the axis of evil in North Korea, Iran, and Iraq, which, of course, leads into the freedom agenda and the U.S. war there. And so I think what the book tries to do is tell the story of how did we get from this speech over here, where we're seeing the Persian Gulf as this vacuum, the British are withdrawing, this is a geopolitical problem, to this speech on the other side, which the U.S. says not only are we accepted and legitimate actors in this region, but we're also going to make sure that we oppose the new axis emerging from this region, and we have the legitimacy to act militarily.
So let's get into it. Trace the metaphoric evolution for me from U.S. presidents, and you've already started to lay out how presidents use metaphor, but I'm sure you can lay that out in a little further detail as you trace the kind of metaphoric evolution from Ford, Nixon, Carter to Reagan to both Bushes and Clinton too. What are the changes in term? What do the terms mean? How do they, as you say, give warrant to policy?
Yeah, so metaphors are a particularly useful way to assess presidential rhetoric, I argue, because, several reasons. Two broad ways that rhetorical scholars like to talk about the effects of rhetoric are to talk about instrumental uses of rhetoric, which is to say we use language, the symbolic resources at our disposal, as an instrumental tool to accomplish particular ends in the world. So I do this, with my family all the time. If I say, please pass the salt, right? I can use my arms and reach across the table and grab the salt. I can, demand it. But ultimately, I use my words to say, hey, I would like the salt. Please pass me the salt, and they pass it to me because I have a nice family. And so there's ways that we use language like this all the time. And that applies to presidents too. Presidents use language to try to get particular things done in the world, whether that's through persuasion or threats or other labels we could attach to that. Really, it's just all about the strategic use of language to get something done. That's the instrumental use of rhetoric. But rhetoric also has this other side to it that scholars talk about called constitutive rhetoric. Is the chosen term. And that means that rhetoric constitutes our understanding of the world. We mediate our understanding of reality through language and through symbols. And so ultimately that means that the discourse that we're using for strategic purposes has constitutive and imaginative effects. It shapes how we understand and view the world in various ways that are subtle and sometimes not so subtle. Metaphor is particularly useful for assessing the constitutive force of presidential rhetoric, because oftentimes we don't encounter presidential rhetoric as a full speech. I study presidential rhetoric for a living. I cannot tell you that I watched every single speech given by Joe Biden in this last presidential administration. And by golly, Donald Trump speaks so often, I probably won't be able to watch all of his speeches either. And so most people don't encounter word for word what a president says or encounter the speech as a coherent, complete text. Really, they're coming at it from a soundbite, a headline, maybe a snippet. Now we have social media, but they're coming at it in these fragments. Stephen Haidt, who's a rhetorical scholar, has a great image of an unstable molecule, that the speech that a president gives is like this molecule that's firing off particles of meaning in every different direction. And those particles are then reassembled as new molecules of meaning. So whether that's in a news report or on a social media post or something like that. Metaphor is helpful because metaphor deals with images and it deals with basic elements of style. You don't have to understand the full text or the full argument to get the metaphor and the image that it's conveying. And that's why I chose metaphor as a particularly apt vehicle to understand how American presidential administrations helped reshape Americans' understanding of the Middle East. Sometimes this was intentional, sometimes it constrained the presidential administrations in question. So the book starts off talking about the vacuum metaphor. Following Harold Wilson's announcement, American policymakers and commentators conceptualized the Persian Gulf as a vacuum that needs stabilization. And the response to that first is twin pillars. So the twin pillars doctrine, and there's some debate as to whether there's a break between Johnson and Nixon, but for the purposes of the book, I describe twin pillars as this coherent rhetorical strategy used by presidential administrations to talk about building up two pillars, Iran and Saudi Arabia, as sources of stability in the Persian Gulf to prevent the Soviets from overstepping containment and influencing the region in a way that would be detrimental to U.S. security interests. And so throughout this process, you have presidents talking about both of these countries as sources of stability, sources of strength, their leaders. There's even there's a couple of different speeches from Richard Nixon, particularly strong about the Shah. What the book does is it traces how these images originated from the archives. If I can find something in National Security Council documents or other archival resources to say, hey, where did this idea come from? I bring it to light. Then I trace how that metaphor spread through the speech of the president and their subordinates, so secretaries of state, sometimes congressional testimony. Assistant Secretary of State Cisco was particularly vocal spokesperson for this era. And then I shift into media coverage. So how were these images picked up in media coverage? And there is a lot of media coverage of Iran in particular that picks up this image of Iran as this pillar of strength in the region. There's an excellent Reader's Digest article that describes him as the new Superman. And what you have here is this image filtering out from deliberations behind closed doors into public statements, into the press, and then I try to find where I can see it reflected in public opinion polling. How did this shift Americans' imagining and understanding of these regions?
Let me dig in on the Iran pillar particularly. I mean, we talk about the twin pillars a lot as historians of U.S. foreign relations, rhetorical scholars, political scientists. It's a fairly well-known conception of the U.S. security situation and strategy in the Middle East in the 1970s. The question for you, is it because that pillar collapsed, because Iran collapsed, that we've historically and retroactively grasped on to that formulation even more than we might have otherwise? Or did we grasp onto it because it already existed and its collapse was so unpredicted, monumentally devastating to U.S. policymakers?
I think you're onto something that it wasn't just the policy question of, oh, we have an ally and now we don't, and that ally doesn't really like us a whole lot. I think it was much more these symbolic resources that have been invested in Iran, these rhetorical resources that have been invested as this is our friend in the region. This is the guardian of the Gulf. We're going to put CIA listening stations on the Caspian Sea. We're going to give the blank check policy. You can buy anything non-nuclear that you want from the U.S. arsenal, and we'll send technicians to help you run it. It was the sense of deep investment and the Iranian regime prior to the revolution that I think when it collapses, it amplifies the effect, both across U.S. public opinion and within the national security community. And I think you're onto something when we see that was such a traumatic experience for those professionals. And really, what I wrap up with in the twin pillar section of the book is talking about the Carter Doctrine, which is this kind of emerging response to say, okay, we don't know what we're going to do, but we know that we're not going to allow this region to fall under Soviet domination, especially in the wake of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And so there's this response from the U.S. to say, we will stabilize this region. We're not really sure where that's going to come from, but for now, the U.S. is going to promise that it will be the security guarantor of last resort.
Right, and that leads us to what? The rapid deployment forces and CENTCOM, and now all of a sudden we have an institutional commitment that carries us decade over decade. But before we get into those coming decades, you now lead us into strategic consensus.
Yes, and this is where Reagan comes in. So Reagan enters office, and I think there's a couple of misconceptions or maybe just underappreciated elements of the Reagan administration when it comes to the Middle East. Obviously, Reagan is a titanic figure when it comes to the Cold War and the U.S. rivalry with the Soviet Union, and deservedly gets a lot of attention for his role in shaping the course of that conflict and its conclusion, as well as, his legacy is so profound in many domestic areas of U.S. life as well. But I think one underexamined area of Reagan's presidency is the Middle East, because if you look at his foreign policy, he's coming into office at a time when the region's politics are changing. You have the Likud party that comes to power in Israel for the first time. You have the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. You have the Iranian Revolution in 1979. You have the Iran-Iraq War that starts shortly thereafter. And you have the early emergings of what we would call radical political Islam, and Juhayman al-Taibi and his radicals seizing the Grand Mosque in Mecca as well around that time. And so you have all of these different currents that are happening. You have civil war in Lebanon, of course. And I think that what Reagan did when he came into office is he said, our focus is on the Cold War. Our focus is on defeating the Soviet Union as the camp of free nations versus totalitarian nations. And he tended to extend that template onto the Middle East when he came into office. And the term he used for that was strategic consensus. And so I argue that strategic consensus operates as kind of an abstract image of everybody's on this side and everybody's on that side. I give the image of like a board meeting where everyone's in agreement, or you can think of a battlefield where you have all the allies lining up on one side against all their enemies on the other. And that was the image he propagated in regards to U.S. policy in the Middle East. And the problem with that is that, of course, the Middle East doesn't map on neatly onto the Cold War and its rivalries. The U.S. is friends with Israel, of course, but also at this point Egypt after the Camp David Accords, and also Jordan. And it's also friends with Saudi Arabia and working out what exactly that means. And so during the Reagan presidency, even though that strategic consensus plan to say we're going to build this regional anti-Soviet alliance to offset Soviet influence in the region, and we're going to blame the Soviets for all of the problems in the region, which, to be fair, the Soviets were causing a lot of problems in the region. They were directly supporting the PLO and terrorist attacks that they were initiating. They were supporting the Syrian regime. They had an off-again, on-again relationship with Iraq. There's a lot of Soviet ties to the region, to be fair. But the idea of an anti-Soviet alliance forming amongst all U.S. friends in the region was just a non-starter. So Al Haig goes to the Middle East in his first overseas trip, tries to sell this idea, doesn't really get a lot of bites. They come back and they say, okay, we're going to reformulate mostly on the basis of bilateral ties. And so the U.S. really invests in, of course, Israel, really invests in Saudi Arabia, profoundly strengthens and transforms that relationship. And so what I do is I trace the legacy of the strategic consensus image, that this idea that we are all on one side facing all of our enemies on that side, I think has two primary legacies over the 1980s. And the first is that it helps to frame Saudi Arabia from this ambivalent country at the end of the 1970s that is somewhat estranged from the U.S. under Carter into a close friend and a close ally. And you see this reflected in public opinion polling and in the discourse used by the Reagan administration to talk about the Saudis. And of course, the Saudis were very instrumental in helping the U.S. in any number of policy areas when it came to fighting communist influence worldwide. I think you also see another legacy of this with the U.S. rhetorical treatment of Iran, which is expected given the Iran-Iraq war and the direction of U.S. relations during that conflict. So it starts off saying Iran is a criminal regime that's outside sort of this two-sided Cold War schema, and then slowly but surely a really interesting evolution happens in Reagan's presidential rhetoric and in internal documents from the administration that I was able to trace at the Reagan Library, where you have this language of hegemonic domination being attributed to the Soviet Union. The Soviets want to be the regional hegemon. They want to dominate the Persian Gulf and its resources and use that to fuel their aims in the world. And slowly but surely that language migrates also to Iran. To be sure, the Soviets are still described as a major threat. That's a major concern. But the Iranians are also increasingly described in the same way. And I think that's a really interesting evolution from this strategic consensus image of this side versus this side. Well, if those are the only two options, then Iran clearly sorts into the enemy camp.
We end the Reagan years, and it's important how you talk about Reagan saw everything through the terms and the lens of the Cold War in terms of foreign policy. That's very clear to me and a lot of others when looking at Reagan's foreign policy. But we end the Reagan years, we kick into the Bush years, and the Cold War is no longer that overarching frame of reference that every president had either worked within or reacted against, for example, in the case of Carter, since the 1940s. And now we're into a new world order, as you lay out. And so how does this new world order start to stitch together different frames of reference, different imaginations and imaginaries about the Middle East?
Yeah, I had a lot of fun researching George H.W. Bush and the Middle East, specifically from a rhetorical vantage point, because there are metaphors and synecdoches everywhere in the discourse surrounding Desert Storm. I mean, even the operations, right? Desert Storm and Desert Shield, these operate as metaphors. But you'll see George H.W. Bush using language like sports metaphors. We fumbled the ball when it came to Iraq. We were cozying up to the regime in Baghdad for a little bit too long. They surprised us with this attack in Kuwait, but now we're not going to fumble again. Or we're going to spike the football after we destroy the Iraqi military. There's all sorts of sports images and language used throughout. And what I do in that chapter is I really trace how the New World Order operated as this composite metaphor. It's this image of a hazy utopian future. It's somewhat ill-defined what exactly it means, but it's this attractive image that says, we're going to create a new world in the wake of the Cold War, and that world is going to be defined by better rules of engagement and better rules of conduct on the international stage. And really, there's two key sub-metaphors that fueled that throughout the Gulf crisis. The first is the Gulf crisis as a test. So the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq under Saddam Hussein, George H.W. Bush framed as a test for the world. This is our first test of the post-Cold War era. Is this going to be a new era that is characterized by interstate violence and warfare, maybe akin back to the 19th century? Or is this going to be an era characterized by global harmony and peace? And the United States, they argued, should firmly land on the second side of that. We're going to make sure that these types of norms aren't violated, and that became an argument for policy, that we can't allow this test to pass. We can't fail this test, otherwise we establish new norms of international conduct. The other one was the metaphor of Hitler as a criminal, and a war criminal, and the analogy to Hitler is, of course, one that gets invoked quite a bit during the Gulf crisis. So the idea that Hitler is this madman who wants to conquer the entire Middle East, that is an image that has a lot of purchase, not just in the United States, but across the world, and images of Saddam Hussein. And so that image of, on one hand, this is a test for the world and the United States leadership of the world. On the other hand, we have someone who is a criminal who doesn't respect international law, who might not stop at anything, akin to dictators we've had to already defeat this century. And those two get mixed up in this idea of the New World Order. And so even though Bush invoked it, he didn't really flesh it out in too much detail. Over the course of making these arguments, he does offer some different rationales for U.S. engagement. And I think this is a really important pivot in U.S., at least rhetorical justifications given for the U.S. investment in the Persian Gulf. And he talks about how not only are we going to stop Saddam Hussein, not only are we going to make sure unfriendly powers don't dominate this region, but now we have a proactive policy of trying to prevent the spread of weapons of mass destruction, a proactive policy of stamping out terrorism that's state-sponsored and grassroots in this region. They have a proactive policy of maintaining peace. And so I think this is a really important pivot point for U.S. policy. And I think the New World Order and these metaphors that the H.W. Bush administration used are really instrumental in seeing how that played out, at least from a public opinion standpoint.
Well, let's kick forward to present day, or recent history. You point out just a few years ago, Joe Biden states we're never going to leave the Middle East. And I think to a cohort of Americans and friends around the world, that's an encouraging statement. And then to a cohort of different Americans and maybe enemies around the world, that's a discouraging statement.
Yeah.
And clearly the Trump administration already has been really engaged in Middle East politics, as it were. How do metaphors keep us entrenched in the region? How do the metaphors keep us locked in the Middle East, perhaps more than any other place on Earth?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of reasons that we could go into for U.S. investment in the Middle East. And, I am not a security official, so I'm not going to weigh in on the security commitments that the U.S. has to that region. But I would just say, from my perspective, it would be quite a catastrophic event should the United States completely withdraw from the region. And at the same time, public opinion is quite clear that Americans don't want to be as involved in that part of the world as the country has been over the past several decades, for sure. Metaphors play a key role in this. The Clinton administration went back to containment, went back to the well, talked about aggressive containment of Iraq and active containment of Iran, which gets labeled as dual containment, and I kind of trace that through the book. But I think up to the present day, you even see metaphors like maximum pressure under Donald Trump's first administration applied to Iran. You see other images used of, Joe Biden talked about how there would be no daylight between the United States and Israel in terms of security policy. Metaphors operate, and they're really lurking everywhere in terms of U.S. discourse surrounding the Middle East, and they function as ways to help legitimize and naturalize the extension of U.S. power in this region, which to this point has become quite natural, and I would argue even to an extent legitimate on the world stage. The U.S. has been in this region for now nearly a century, and so the fact that the United States operates as this security guarantor for the region means that the U.S. has this role of upholding security, and the normal everyday American on the street might not fully understand the strategic picture for that. And so I think what you have here is this dynamic interplay where metaphors and justifications and political rhetoric and all the forms of symbolic action, right? In the wake of the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th in 2023, you have images that are coming out and stories that are coming out of that horrific incident. And on the other side, you have TikTok videos trending of Gazans who have been harmed by Israeli military action. All of these are examples of how rhetoric or symbolic action, broadly considered, works to shape and motivate public policy. It provides warrants for U.S. understanding of the region, warrants for policy, and it helps shape why Americans either support what the U.S. is doing in the region or don't. Right? And so now I would say we've maybe gone to this age where we have this war of metaphors and war of images that are happening. And perhaps synecdoche might be a better term of reference, because if you see one image or one really heartrending video, all of a sudden you imagine that part represents the whole of the conflict. Whereas maybe it's a bit more complicated than that.
Well, let's talk about another area of metaphor related to the Middle East and to U.S. foreign policy, the Blob. And metaphor in the Blob. It's quite clear that the person who termed that, and he wouldn't be the only person we've heard about. The high priesthood of defense intellectuals, which has now again been reinterpreted as the Blob, but the accusation, if you will, or the judgment is that the Blob effectively defines a problem and thereby limits the solutions to said problem. Unpack that metaphor for me, though. How the Blob operates in the national security space, and also why it might be an apt metaphor.
So I think the Blob obviously operates as this image that pops into the mind immediately of this amorphous mass that moves in unpredictable but still slow and steady directions. I think of images of a large wave coming down, maybe lava, or before the recording we were talking about different disasters where you have something like a substance coming down a hill that people have to avoid. And I think there's a lot of ways that the Blob is a pretty apt metaphor. The idea that U.S. security officials tend to move in a herd and move slowly in a particular gradient is really key. And if I'm thinking about the Blob in terms of defining problems, I would argue that metaphor is really key, because the way that we see the world, the way that we see certain problems as problems is quite instrumental in that. So I'll give you a quick example drawn from the book. So the Clinton administration decides in its second term really to take on what it calls the unholy axis in a speech before the United Nations of drug traffickers, rogue states, and human trafficking. And so it talks about, terrorism. So drug trafficking, terrorism, rogue states. And they say, we're going to attack this unholy trinity, this unholy axis, and see that as a problem that we need to address on the world stage. Well, of course, terrorism is a long-standing security issue. Drug trafficking, of course, is something that most people don't want more of, but it hadn't been defined as a national security issue until around that moment. And what you have with Clinton naming that is an opportunity to sort of lower the gradient for the Blob to maybe go down the hill and see this as a problem worth addressing and marshaling its vast resources to try to combat. So I think the Blob is an apt metaphor in certain ways. I think the idea of moving in a mass, once we see something, it's an unstoppable force to hit it, I think is key. And really the metaphor I use in the book, I use two, to describe the overall transformation of U.S. views of the Persian Gulf, and more broadly the Middle East that took place during the time period of the book. The first is an analogy. So Theodore Roosevelt gave the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine early in the 20th century, said that the United States would assume a police power, suzerainty over South America and Latin America more broadly if these countries are going to go in a direction that's contrary to U.S. interests, that's contrary to the general welfare. That the U.S. would intervene and make sure that things go in a way that they ought to go. And I think that might be an analogous way to think about how presidents now operate. And the U.S. overall operates in the Persian Gulf. We're not trying to colonize the region. We're not trying to dominate the region in a sense of imposing our culture there. But I think there is this sense of we want to make sure that things are going in the way that are in line with U.S. security interests, and we sort of hold that police power in reserve. The other one is Robert Entman has this great image of cascading activation. It's like this waterfall where images come down from on high and come down to one level of the waterfall and the next level and the next level, and they pool at the bottom. And unless you have a really powerful pump, which I know in the DC area, sometimes you get flooding and sometimes pumps are really essential if you have a cellar. If you don't have a really powerful pump, it's hard to get that water back out. And so unless you have a really compelling counterframe to metaphors that structure the way that the blob is maybe going down the hill, it's really difficult to reverse. So I love the image of inertia from the blob that you bring up. I love the way that the blob is kind of this inevitable force that can't be resisted. It's going to go down the hill that it's going to go down. And if you push against it, you'll just be sucked up into it. I think that's a really powerful image that captures a lot about how deliberations over national security take place today.
Well, we've talked a lot about a lot of different topics, from Cotton Mather to the Blob, and to baseball in Israel. And I think it's now time for us to move into our section that we have at every episode, which is our hints for history. What do we need to think more about, Randall?
Yeah, I think thinking more about how political developments in other parts of the world, that places that we might not even think of, can really have an outsized effect later on down the line. And I think one example that struck me while doing the research for this book was the fact that after the Civil War, the United States sent Confederate and Union soldiers to serve as mercenaries in the wars of Egypt and Ethiopia and Sudan. And that opened up an entire world of discourse, an entire world of understanding of the Middle East that shaped a lot of the ways that Americans then moved into the region in the early 20th century. And I also think of, political movements like political Islam, right, that come from very, not very impressive necessarily origins, but then grow and become major political movements. And so I think one of the things that I've learned to appreciate is looking for the non-obvious, looking for the thing, maybe digging in an archive. The Reagan administration, of course, is that the archives are housed in Simi Valley, and it's a lovely place to go. And I'm really happy to be able to hopefully go there again in the future. But it's a really interesting way to go to an archive, dig around, and see the seeds of something that you might know now has flowered into a major movement or a major event, but at the time wasn't seen as something very significant.
Well, Randall, thanks so much for joining us on the show. And once again, listeners, please go out and purchase Securing the Prize, Presidential Metaphor, and U.S. Intervention in the Persian Gulf. Thank you very much, Randall.
Thank you, Anthony.
Rendezvous with History is a podcast produced by the Ronald Reagan Institute's scholarly initiatives. You can learn more at ronaldreaganinstitute.org and follow along on social media at Reagan Institute.